Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our virtual convening, Advancing Criminal Justice Reform Through a 21st Century Latinx Lens. I'm Sonia Diaz, the founding director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, and I'm so thrilled to be here along with our partners, Latino Justice PearlDeaf, the Drug Policy Alliance, and the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators to host this two-day convening focused on the interconnected and diverse experiences of the nation's Latinx communities, the ways that they've historically been left out of justice reform, and the opportunity to build political power to advance robust transformations and create more resilient communities. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a timely conversation, and it comes as people across the nation continue to the streets to support the movement for Black lives, because Black lives matter. And this is also happening in paralleling the rise in anti-Asian sentiment and the historical threads of discrimination against our Asian American community members. And so when we are here over the course of these 2 days, we are here to reinforce the need to leverage this momentum for multiracial, multi-ethnic power building, not only in our communities, but across halls of power. And so to that point, it's important to ensure that we have a nuanced understanding of the nation's diverse and youthful Latino communities. Latinos have been overrepresented in the penal system, but underrepresented at the tables that determine their fate. Decimated and invisible by COVID-19, yet critical to recovery. And it's in the face of these paradoxes that we understand that we need robust conversations, not just among Latinos, but among all leaders. And that is why you were chosen to be here today. And that is why we hope together that we will collaborate so that these discussions can yield action, can yield momentum, and can yield transformation. I think that today and tomorrow will bring us together to fight for the reforms necessary that create not only justice, but dignity and opportunity. And to that end, I'm so excited to introduce my colleague, Kenneth Romero. He's the Director, Executive of National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators.
Thank you, Sonia. I want to join you in welcoming everyone to this forum. As you mentioned, my name is Kenneth Romero. I'm the Executive Director of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators and the incoming chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which is the coalition of over 40 of the most important Hispanic organizations in the nation. And HCSL is truly proud to partner today with UCLA, as well as Latino Justice PearlDeaf and the Drug Policy Alliance. A special thank you to our good friends Juan Cartagena and Cassandra Frederick for including us in the program. We are excited about the comprehensive program and topics that we covered today and tomorrow. Once we conclude, there will be much more work that lies ahead, but right now we are ready to roll up our sleeves with you and continue to bring forth issues that affect our communities and work toward policy solutions that effectuate real transformative change. We also invite you to the booths on our events page and learn more about each one of our organizations. Today, we are opening our program with a star-studded plenary in the world of criminal justice reform. It is my distinct honor to introduce none other than Maria Hinojosa, who will be moderating the opening plenary. Maria Hinojosa has helped tell America's untold stories and brought to light heroes in the United States and abroad. She is the host of NPR's Latino USA and the anchor of Emmy Award-winning talk show Maria Hinojosa One-on-One. In 2010, Maria also launched the Futuro Media Group, whose mission is to produce multi-platform community-based journalism, giving critical voices to the voiceless by harnessing the power of independent media to tell stories that are oftentimes overlooked and underreported. If this were not enough, Maria is the author of 3 books. Her newest one is Once I Was You, a memoir of love and hate in a torn America. Be sure to stay tuned and learn how to receive your own copy of her book. With that, I will turn it over to our good friend, Maria Hinojosa.
Thank you, Kenneth and Sonia. I appreciate that. What's up, everybody? How you doing? It's really my honor to be here. Although I wish we didn't have to be having this conversation, right? I wish we were living in a time when this had been taken care of and solved. But as you know, actually the situation is getting worse. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing the introductions because you already know who these people are. So I just want to bring on Julissa Arce, the extraordinary immigrant activist and writer, and Dr. Kelly Lytle-Hernández, the genius from UCLA. Yes. The judge, Honorable Natalia Cornelio from Texas 351st District Court, and SUAVE, who, if you don't know SUAVE, you got to listen to the podcast SUAVE. And actually, SUAVE, I'm going to start with you. And a couple of things. If you have questions for the panel, you should be sending them in now, however it is that you're supposed to send them in. And I'm going to be looking at your questions. And I always like to make the panel as interactive as possible, incorporating your questions as soon as possible. Because we could talk amongst ourselves for a long time, but we really want to hear what your thoughts, what you're thinking, and what you want to know. So send in your questions, and we'll start getting to them at the top. And to my panelists, interrupt each other, okay? Let's imagine that we're so don't feel. I know that there's a judge on the panel, and we're all like, and that there's a genius award winner here, and that there's, extraordinary people. But we can go ahead and interrupt each other. Do not wait for me. It's a conversation. So just to set this up, and I think, SUAVE, you know the question I'm going to ask you. So SUAVE and I have been communicating since 1993, when I met SUAVE, who was sentenced to life in prison as a juvenile. SUAVE and I have multiple conversations by phone over, several decades now, 2 decades. And SUAVE was in for life. He was in Graterford State Prison in Pennsylvania, one of the largest state prisons in the country. It was a challenge. The first time SUAVE cried on the phone was when he was joining my class at DePaul University, and he was asked a question about Latinos, undocumented people in the detention facility. SUAVE, maybe you want to tell us why that question made you cry for the first time, that in all of the times that we had been talking, that was the first time you cried, even after solitary confinement and missing your mother's death. And this was what made you cry, talking about undocumented and Latino immigrants in a state correctional facility. Why? What did you see, and why did it move you so much? Yes. Oh, yeah. No, talk, SUAVE. Nope. So you're on mute. Do you want to unmute your phone? Unmute the mic? Okay. So SUAVE, we're gonna.
Yeah, hear me now?
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for them great words, Maria, and thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. And yes, I spent 31 and a half years in prison. I spent 7 of them in solitary confinement, and I never shed a tear because I never wanted the system to see me break, but, as a advocate in the prison, I started noticing a trend where they was bringing illegal immigrants into the prison, and they did not want to get visits. They did not want to sign up for phone calls. So they had no outside communication, or no outside support. So they had to survive somehow. But some of the prison guards was taking advantage of that, and they was using them to sweep the cell blocks and to clean the cell blocks. And be mindful, I'm in a jail where the cell blocks are 2 football fields long. And these brothers were just cleaning the block for extra food, for extra trays that the prison's supposed to give you. And I took that as real personal because they wouldn't do it to me. Why do it to somebody that look like me, somebody that got the same color of my skin? So that took me to the point where I used to go to commissary myself and just buy all these commissary items. And I used to tell the guys, you don't have to do that. Don't degrade yourself for that. You know, and the guards used to give them labels. They used to call them the new blacks. The new blacks. Because they did the job that other prisoners did not want to do, which was sweep the block, clean the showers for nothing. These are jobs that they're supposed to pay other confined citizens to do, but they was using people for extra trays, for garbage. What they give you in them food trays is garbage. But these brothers had to do it because they had no outside support. And that was probably the only time that I broke down, because I was frustrated, because I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what. You know, in prison, when you react with emotions, most of the time they land you in solitary confinement, and I wasn't trying to go to solitary confinement. So I just broke down. That was like the only time that I realized that I was human.
Yeah.
Most of the time, for 31 years, I never cried. My mother died. I never cried. That was like the only time that I cried in front of 500 people on the block.
It was deep. It was deep. An interesting connection. The prison where Suave served was 100 years old. And of course, they needed to build a new prison. So they built a new prison right next door. Brand spanking new, all shiny, lights on 24/7, all technological and everything, but more horrible, more dehumanized. The old prison where Suave served his sentence, which I was like, well, they're going to use it for a movie set because it's like out of the Shawshank Redemption. No, they're refurbishing to open it, apparently still, Suave, as an immigrant detention facility. So there's the connection right there. They're closing a prison, but they're opening it up to hold criminal immigrants. Kelly, what's going on? I mean, you two are on the streets, and I love that Suave is with Kelly. I consider the both of you geniuses, and so I just really love that the both of you have that label in my book. Kelly, when you're hearing what Suave is saying, and you're thinking about, and then they're going to make that horrible prison. Now they're going to open it up to hold immigrants. What's going on for you?
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be with everyone. And thank you, Suave, for telling your story. For me, as a historian, I think about the intersections that we've had between the criminal legal regime and the immigration regime. And so I want to tell a little story and talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground right now to challenge that intersection. So when we talk about the folks that Suave was mentioning, in many cases who are being picked up and sent to certainly federal prison, but often routing through local and state prison to federal prison. Many of the undocumented folks are facing the charge called 1325 or 1326 in the federal code. And I see the judge shaking her head because this is what's really filling our federal criminal legal system right now. It puts the lights on, it builds new buildings. It is the engine of federal law enforcement. What those two pieces of legislation are is the misdemeanor of illegal entry into the United States and the felony of criminal illegal reentry to the United States after a deportation. And these are federal laws. I want to talk about the history of these federal laws and why we know that they're fundamentally white supremacist and anti-Latino and anti-Black. This piece of legislation came to us first in 1929. It was not a crime to cross any border prior to 1929. And the legislator who brought it to us, to the United States Congress, was a man named Coleman Livingston Blease. And he was an unrepentant white supremacist from South Carolina who told N-word poems from the floor of Congress, who vocally advocated for lynchings, whose singular purpose in Congress was to defend white supremacy and Jim Crow. He is the person who brought us this piece of legislation called 1325, 1326, because he and a band of other legislators were concerned about the large number of Mexican immigrants at that time period in particular who were coming across the southern border. And one, they had the Border Patrol to round people up and send them home. But when people escaped the Border Patrol, they wanted another tool to punish non-white folks who were coming to this country. And that was the criminalization of unauthorized entry into the United States. So that's where this piece of legislation comes from. It is the #1 piece of legislation sending people to federal prison today, not just Latinos, but across the entire population, is what's driving the rise of the federal penal system. So in many cases where you see new jails and prisons popping up, it's to house people who have violated 1325 or 1326. So these are sort of just some of the ways that this all comes together. The kind of classic Jim Crow white supremacy being the origins of the anti-immigrant legislation that we see in place today. And so that kind of marginalization, Suave, that you were seeing inside it's so profound, it's so historically deep, and it's so intersected with all the stories that Sonia had lifted up earlier, being anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Latinx. So I'm just so glad to be in this conversation with everyone today.
So, Judge, you probably more than us might have a sense of what these places look like. And I'm kind of obsessed with two things. I'm talking about the detention facilities. I'm obsessed with invisibility and erasure. And I'm also obsessed with the moment when someone approaches former governor of Texas, George W., and basically says, listen, that pro-immigrant thing you got going on, it's post 9/11, and you need to realize that there are 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. Therefore, we can make money off of housing them. There are not 11 to 12 million, convicted criminals running around, but there are undocumented people. We can make money off of them if private prison now intersects with immigration detention. Judge, when you hear these two obsessions of mine, erasure and that connection between money, private prison, and detention facilities, what goes on for you?
Yeah, those are legitimate fears. Thank you for having me. And I'm so impressed to hear someone else refer to 1325 and 1326, because as someone who grew up, as a professional in the legal system, I moved to Texas and became a federal public defender before becoming a judge, because I learned that immigration status is criminalized, and the felony, people face up to 20 years in prison. And that's in prison before going through the immigration process and being deported. And I was so offended. And I wanted to do work on the front lines of that. I think what you see in the system, to your point about invisibility, I think that that's right. And I think that folks that get jobs in the system, including folks in positions like mine, lawyers, we get really familiar with these treatments and these laws becoming normal, right? So it's not uncommon for a judge in McAllen to see 75 individuals in a day in shackles for illegally entering. And in fact, the family separation that became national news for a long time, that started with 1325 cases, with people being arrested for a misdemeanor and then having their kids forcibly taken from them with no process. It was just because they were arrested for that charge. That usually
and to just clarify on the family separate, I mean, I would say I don't have the data, but many of these people are coming to be back with their families. So it was an intention of coming back to be with your family that then you are criminalized for that.
Exactly. And sometimes it would be people that had gotten visas, were asked to come here to work, and then maybe something happened, maybe a small crime, maybe a drug crime resulted in a deportation. And then when they're back, to be reunited with everything that they've known and come to build, because this country brought people in, they were facing, 20 years in the penitentiary. To your point on invisibility, I will say something in Texas especially, there's not good data, there's not good information about how many Latinos are even in the system. We're still categorized as white. We're miscategorized. I see probation reports all the time where someone who is not a citizen of here or is not white is categorized as white. And it's a huge problem in us being able to organize and advocate to make change. and identify the problem so that we could say, this is what needs to change.
i.e. erasure and invisibility. It doesn't kind of get clearer than that. Julissa, you know a little bit about money and you know a lot about being an immigrant, right? To me, that connection of the money-making thing is part of what we're not able to see. What kind of draws you into this conversation? Is it the money aspect that it's like until we unlock the Wall Street connection and the capitalist connection of this, or I mean, frankly, the humanity of it? What comes up for you as we're thinking about this and our connection to also the Black Lives Matter movement, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm so honored to be amongst this incredible group of people. So thank you so much. There are a few connections that we're talking about that really draw me into the work. I mean, the money connection, I always sort of say you have to follow the money to find the answers and to find the root of problems. And when you're talking about Wall Street, I've read the CoreCivic and GEO Group, which are two of the private prison companies, the publicly traded private prison companies. I've read their 10-Ks and sort of their reports in which they specifically call the detention of immigrants a, quote, value creation opportunity for their shareholders, right? And if you remember during the Obama years when the federal government ended their contracts with private prisons to hold federal prisoners, which was then reinstated by the Trump administration. But because of those ending of those contracts for federal prisoners in private prison companies, these publicly traded companies had to find a way to continue to make money for their shareholders. And where could they make that money? From immigrants. And you have to kind of look at the lobbying that that companies like CoreCivic and GEO Group, the lobbying that they do to pass laws that further criminalize Black and brown people and immigrants. And so it is no surprise that as the federal government ends contracts to hold private prisoners, that these companies are going to further look into immigrant communities to detain people. Many people don't know that there are Congress mandated quotas to hold a certain number of immigrants in detention centers. There is a number of beds that have to be filled every day and every week that are mandated by Congress. And
it's like
those laws.
We're like at 35,000. That went up, it went down, but about 35. So that guarantees that people who make money off of immigrant detention facilities are guaranteed a profit every single day because of the possibility of holding 35,000 people whose essential difference is that we were not born here.
Yep.
So Julissa, you could end up there too.
Yeah,
I could end up there as well. I mean,
yeah, and this whole time that we're talking about, how do immigrants end up in prison and what's the pipeline between local police and ending up in a federal detention center? I mean, I know we said, they could be small crimes like drug possession, but it's even more minor than that, right? Somebody could end up in a detention center because of a traffic stop. And as someone who was formerly undocumented, who had to drive without a driver's license because the state of Texas does not allow undocumented to have driver's licenses, every time I got in a car and I drove to the grocery store or I drove to school, that could have happened to me. So there are those links. And then you bring up, you asked about sort of Black Lives Matter. How does all of this intersect? More and more, it is Black immigrants that are ending up in detention center, right? So Black immigrants are ending up in detention centers. They are deported at higher rates than other immigrants. So that intersection is certainly there. But the other piece of it, and I think we're going to get to that, is sort of just the policing system, the criminal justice system, police brutality, and to your point about invisibility, many times the police violence in Latino communities is invisible. And part of that is because historically, we don't know the roots of police as it relates to Latino communities. And we don't have the data, as it was just, it was mentioned by the judge that many times we are labeled white, and therefore we don't know the magnitude of the problem. And if we can't understand the magnitude of the problem, then it is difficult to see its urgency. And that's why I'm really excited to have this conversation to kind of really shed a light on what those numbers and the magnitude of the problem is.
So you've already started to send in your questions. So thank you for that. And there's a really good one that I'm dying to get to. But first, before we do that, I want to, and by the way, again, to my panelists, so you can interrupt each other. It's okay. It's like a conversation. But if I'm just like the moment that it is truly unlocked, the relationship between the Black Lives Matter movement and what's happening in terms of the attack on immigrants, whose only difference, again, is that we were not born in this country. The way I set it up is I say, okay, if the original sin was slavery, the first sin was genocide. That means you have anti-Indigenous hatred on top of anti-Black hatred. A natural next would be anti-immigrant hatred, anti-Latino hatred, anti-Asian hatred. It all kind of trickles down from it. And I'm just like, the moment when, something massive happens that connects the Black Lives Matter movement with, and it's happened in the past, but can we talk about that solidarity and how we get there, knowing what we all know, that there is anti-Blackness in Latino communities, that there is, all of that complicated stuff. We don't have to say it out there because everybody knows what we're talking about. So who wants to jump in terms of just like, okay, go Suave. What does it look like, that solidarity?
First, I'm blown away that the judge talked about it, because in the prison where I was at, when I first went in, you was either Black or white, period. There was no Latinos, and it cost me like 3 years in solitary confinement fighting this stuff, because I refused to be classified Black or white. I gave my Afro Latinos, and it was like, nope, Black or white. And I just said, put me in the hole. And so I'm glad you brought that up. But in the prisons that I've been in, you always see the separation between Blacks and Latinos. There's always been that. For whatever reason, I don't understand it, but it always been that. So I was in a maximum security prison where I decided we got to stop this, because the same boot that was being pressed against the Black man in the prison, it was being pressed against my neck. And so I called meetings with some of the leaders in the prison, some of the Black leaders in the prison. And we created a culture that it was cool for them to be in our section of the jail. We ate together, we shower in the same shower together, and we rode together. And we became a force in the institution, where the institution was like, I remember a superintendent saying, right up the movie from Malcolm X, y'all have too much power. Because what I did as president of the organization in the prison, I made all the Blacks and the NAACP and all the other organizations members of LACEL, which is the Latin American Culture Exchange Organization. And they made all the Latinos members of their organization. So now we have, instead of 2,000 Latinos, now we have 4,000 people in one organization. That we could say, we're not going to eat, we need change, and we got the change. We managed to turn a jail that was seeing 4 or 5 stabbings a day, 1 murder a week, into an institution of colleges where all my board members in LaSalle had bachelor's degree from college program that we started in the prison, and I always say out here, the Black Lives Matters groups in Philadelphia, I'm not down with them. And I'll be honest, because it seems like they're still suffering from that. We not going into that Latino community, and we staying in this side of the city. And I have a problem with that. Because in Philadelphia, we seen a murder rate that's like, we about to reach 500 murders this year, and most of them are brown and Black faces. So why not come together and
So,
protest that.
and I think, the thing that we appreciate about SUAVE, if you haven't listened to the podcast, right, is SUAVE, as we say in Mexican Spanish, no tiene pelos en la lengua. O sea, SUAVE just straight up. It is complicated. Who wants to kind of jump in on the issue of what happened, how we get beyond those movements that tend to see themselves as distant instead of separate? Who wants to jump in?
Yeah. Well, I can jump in quickly about, I used to sort of ask myself when I was first in the US, like, where were we? Like, where were Latinos? Because everything I was learning in school was told through a racial binary, right? The stories were white and the stories were Black. And so I didn't know where I fit into this racial conversations, because it felt like there wasn't a place for me in those spaces and in those conversations. Now that I've grown up and I've learned a lot of history, and I'm so happy we have a genius historian with us, because she'll provide a lot more context than I can. But in learning that history is when I realized that this racial binary was created to uphold white supremacy. Because what it does, it makes all of us believe that proximity to whiteness is what's going to keep us safe. It's what's going to give us belonging. And in doing that, we try to distance ourselves from Black communities and get closer to white communities. And we've seen that in history through many, many different ways. But what I like to also shed a light on is the history of how we have come together in beautiful and meaningful and respectful ways throughout history, because I think that it's purposeful that we don't learn about those ways that we've come together, so that we think that always and historically we've been apart. We hear stories of Felix Tijerina, who was the president of LULAC in the 1950s and 1960s, who said, let the Negro fight his own battles. And we hear about that all the time. And I see sort of his picture on tweets all the time. And actually, they many times confuse him with Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who actually led a coalition of Latinos for the Poor People's March on Washington, who organized with Black Panther leader Bobby Seale, who then, and then Huey Newton, when he was in prison, recorded a message of support for a group of Latinos, of young Latinos who had been accused of murdering a cop. And so, I think that as much as we need to unpack the ways in which there have been fractures in our communities, we also need to shed a light in the ways in which we have come together, so that we can learn from those instances and come together now. Because, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll pass the mic, is we need to realize that as long as we see each other as the enemy, white supremacy will continue to win.
So can I interrupt for a minute?
Go ahead.
My thing is, how do I, a community activist that's fighting for the human rights of people, not only in prison, but in my community, how do I convey that message to them when most Latinos feel like they being discriminated by Blacks?
Okay.
How do we, how do I convey that message to them?
I have a thought. I do think our youth are a little bit ahead of us on this, and that's what gives me hope. I think I helped my grandma out because she wasn't always super open-minded. Mexicans have our own discriminations internally, and so and I see the youth coming together and supporting other communities more and more. So I'm really hopeful with that. And I think, Julissa, I loved your comments. I think that all of this work is an uphill battle. It's thankless. Every progress we make, we get smacked in the face with something else. Hearing your story that you had to go to solitary for not identifying as Black or white, that's horrendous. And it's how life is. We fight for something and we get pushed back, and it's thankless, and we succeed and then we step back. And so I think this process is like that. And I do have some hope that the youth are teaching us.
That's okay. Thank you, Judge, for saying that it's the long term. And I know we get frustrated. To me, SUAVE, aquí in person, I'm like, if I could touch him, no, he's on the screen. So this is what hope and never giving up hope looks like, as huge as the battle may be. Because activists understood and scientists understood that it's not right to sentence a juvenile to life without parole, mandatory. And they never gave up and organized, and that's how SUAVE got out. And we're just so thankful. So continue. Thank you, Judge, for saying it's thankless. It's over. It happens all the time. You'll go to bed upset and crying. Please get to nature and heal yourself. But we got to keep on doing this, frankly, to save our country. Okay, a couple of questions. I know Kelly, I'm just like, I want to hear what Kelly has to say. Okay, let me just incorporate a couple of questions that we've gotten from the audience. And Kelly, I'm going to throw it to you. And you can kind of incorporate your answers as you see fit. So one question was in regards to the title of this particular convening, reform. So where does the hope from reform come from? Do we want to reform, or this is my part, or, completely take down and recreate? From Giovanni Serrano Laguna, how can we mobilize and organize against codes 325 and 326? I'm thinking a lot about that. From Stephen Huerta, this is basically how do we bring an end to the hostilities that Black Lives Matter has maybe potentially towards Latino activists? It doesn't make sense. So Kelly, want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the last question. I have to say, I am a Black scholar, and I've spent 2 decades of my career dedicated to telling Latino stories. And for me, it's understanding who we are as communities and as people at a deep, intimate level will be one of the keys, right? Yes, we need to study our own and know our own stories, but we got to reach out to our neighbors as well. And I got to understand how you got here and the struggles that you have faced to thrive, and how we got into the similar situation to the similar neighborhood, right? So SUAVE, you talked about the boot, right? The same boot that's on your neck is the same boot on African-American necks. And thinking back to what Maria was talking about, that it begins with genocide and moves through anti-Blackness and enslavement, and then becomes an anti-immigrant, non-white immigrant narrative. For me, the way that I think about the struggles that we collectively face together is that, and I'm gonna push hard in this setting, that we are not a nation of immigrants. That is a lie, it is a myth, and we have to let it go. And every time we say it, it hurts Indigenous folks and Black folks who do not belong in that story. We are a nation of settlers. This place was created for a very small sliver of people, white men, straight, with heteronormative families. There are like 22 people like that in this country, right? This is a nation that's been built to preserve priorities and preferences and privileges for that small settler community. We just came out of an era where we had a settler on fire in the presidency, and he was doing everything he could in every region to implement this sort of great vision, manifest destiny of what this country really is. It is not a nation of immigrants, it is a nation of settlers. And we collectively, Black folks, Indigenous folks, non-white immigrants, queer folks, poor folks, everybody need to organize to tell the lie, right? To unveil the lie, unmask the lie, and rebuild a country, a community in which all of us can thrive and live together. So that's the first piece. I will say that here in Los Angeles, Black Lives Matter, that is not my feeling at all that's coming from the movement. South Central is the most beautiful place on earth, if you ask me, and Black and brown folks are doing it right. So maybe we need to turn to South Central. Manuel Pastor.
Yeah, that's where I live.
I was
live
going to
in
say,
South Central.
I was going to say, though, SUAVE, you've never been to LA, though.
Come SUAVE.
So I think we have to.
LA when I was in when I was in federal custody, and they shipped me out, and they put me in Los Angeles next to a tuna factory, and it smelled bad.
Wow, SUAVE. I never knew that. Even though SUAVE and I have been in touch, I never knew that. But there is that point. I know you want to jump in, Julissa. Go.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. So, I think when it comes to police violence and the killings of Black and brown people at the hands of police, I have to say that it is thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement and their hard work that there's even attention placed on the killings of Latinos at the hands of police. It is their organizing and their relentless work that has led us to this place. So I have to acknowledge that. And, maybe it is because I live in Los Angeles and I live in South Central. And when I go to Black Lives Matter protests here, it is Black Lives Matters Los Angeles that gives the stage and gives the mic to families, to Latino families who have been affected by police violence. And, when I go to stand on I learned from Black Lives Matter protests that I can actually print out a poster of Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old kid who was shot and killed in Chicago, and go to a street corner and put my little poster up. Like I would not have thought that I had the right to do that if it was not because of how Black Lives Matter shows up. And so I think there's a lot we can learn. But I do also have to say that many times the conversations we have about push and pulls of our communities, we focus on the anti-Blackness in the Latino community. And I think that's really important, and we have to talk about it, and we have to understand that it comes from the same place. But I do also think that, sometimes it's scary to say there are also push and pulls coming from the Black community. And there are times, I saw a video where there was, there's been many street vendors in the community who have been robbed or who have been whatever. And it's scary to talk about because sometimes we take the conversation someplace else and it gets really close to this anti-Blackness. So we have to be careful that when we have these conversations, we keep them focused where they need to be focused, and that we don't also play into this because, as I said earlier, we have to realize that the times that we have come together, we have won more than we have lost. And I live in South Central. I haven't lived here very long. I moved here recently. I lived in a different neighborhood before. But, my neighbors are Black. My neighbors are immigrants. My neighbors are Latino. And everybody knows everybody's names. We have a neighbor who suffers from mental illness. And there's not one single neighbor here who would think, let me call the police because my neighbor is, acting up. Like, that wouldn't happen here. So I take a lot of hope and pride in the neighborhood in which I live and who my neighbors are. So just wanted to say that.
So I do think that is, I think back because I'm a little bit older than all y'all. Don't laugh, Suave. So when Martin Luther King and the struggle for civil rights was on fire in the 1960s, and I was a little girl, like, it was clear what side we were on for us. There was something about the way in which Martin Luther King spoke that there was a complete and understanding, and that actually cemented me as who I saw myself as an American, because, as I've said, Dr. Martin Luther King was the first one who made me think, well, maybe I could be a part of this country. Maybe I could. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because we're living through another one of those moments now when my adult children, definitively on the side of Black Lives Matter, apart from the fact that their father is Afro-Latino and my daughter identifies as Afro-Taína Mexican. So there will be moments and decisions made in this moment in history where Latina families will be forever changed because of the Black Lives Matter movement. That, in my sense, that's something that is a positive. Let me just incorporate. Hold on, a question. We've got a question. It said, this is a question from Jimmy Aliaga, who says, how can we better attack the deeply embedded, overly punitive attitudes in mainstream society that led to this over-incarcerated reality? Well, a lot of it has to do with the mainstream media. And I think, Kelly, you were giving us the sense of the history of this country as settlers. Thank you so much for that. But also, just so we're clear, the majority of all of the mainstream media that we consume is owned, operated, the buck stops with heteronormative white men of privilege.
That's right.
And they decide how we all get the news. Okay, here's another question from Cynthia Amezcua. How is the movement towards abolition of ICE, prisons, police received in the Latinx community? Is the future that abolitionists envision a future that the Latinx community can stand behind? Good question. So who wants to jump in? Judge, I'm gonna actually, Judge, we haven't heard from you in a minute.
I'm like,
go.
I have a lot to say, but I'm like, I've already said a lot, so I'm gonna
and
take
I'm
a
like,
step
I
back.
have all these judicial ethical rules, so I'm like, do I really want to speak on abolitionism? I will say,
Yes, please do.
I mean,
As somebody who is part of a system now that we need to understand, yes, we really would appreciate your perspective on that.
yes, I think that one of the things I embrace as an elected judge is, the second something better than me is created, I need to back off and not hold on to this job. And I don't know that everybody that has a position like mine is like that, but I think that we have to build as much as possible things that the purported criminal justice system purport to treat, right? I mean, the need for housing and treatment and mental health resources and just community infrastructure support, people that will support you, it's so dire. And we have all of this invested into, I have 3,000 cases on my docket, and I'm one of 22 felony judges in Harris County, which is, the Houston area. That's so much resource that goes to that instead of and then I have all these people coming through and they don't have a place to stay. And I'm thinking about bond, and the state's like, well, they don't have a place to stay. And I'm like, well, the jail is not that place either, right? And so I think that how the language of those movements, there's a lot of work to do on education and understanding those movements, but all of our communities need to understand that we deserve to thrive. We deserve to be invested in, and we have needs that are not being built up. And unfortunately, when there's finite budgets and other things, we need to shift priorities and demand what will actually permit us to thrive. I love the media point, by the way, because in Texas, bail reform is something that I care very much about. And there's like a news story every day about whether someone's on bail or not when something happens. There's a tiger in Houston and they're like, and he was on bail. And it's just like, well, what about the 3,800 people on my docket out of 4,000 that are like actually checking in? They have their jobs. Why aren't they a news story every day? So I just wanted to lift up your experience with media and how big of a role it plays on where we land and organize on these important issues.
Yeah, well, don't get me started on the role of the media.
Well, media is one of the reasons we saw the inflection in mass incarceration in the super predator theory that our current president put out when he was up there, and Hillary Clinton, the super predator. That's when we start seeing the inflection of juveniles getting life sentences across the United States. So
because it builds on this whole notion that we are a threat. Look, I think 1325 and 1326 are huge. I'm glad you named it. Thank you for that. Another thing that I'm obsessed about is how immigrants are criminalized for things that should not be criminalized. For example, I don't know. Let's see, the state of Colorado. Oh my gosh, let's see, the state of New York. What? Oh, marijuana is legal just about everywhere. Not in Texas, but and yet, for smoking a joint on the street that somebody can make millions of dollars off of in capitalist profit, but that person will then go to prison and then be deported for smoking a joint. To me, this is another way in which it's like criminalizing for what one sheriff said to me was a ticky-tacky crime. How do we live in this system that is full of these kinds of contradictions?
I wanted to come back to something about abolition, because I think that a lot of people forget, like, for example, when we talk about ICE and the current, like, the Department of Homeland Security, people think that calling for the abolition of ICE is like this crazy radical thing. And I mean, it is. And I subscribe to that radical idea and that radical thought. But when you think about it, it's actually not that crazy, because DHS didn't exist before 2001, right? So it's not like this institution has been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Like, we can actually imagine a world in which ICE doesn't exist, in which immigrant detention doesn't exist. And if you take a look at maybe, I love history, and like if I could go back in time, I would study history instead of studying finance in college. But if you think about just even immigration, where it has been, like immigration used to be an office in the Department of Labor. It wasn't part of it wasn't part of national security, right? Because we viewed immigration as a positive, net positive to the economy. And so it was in the Labor Department. And so it's not crazy to think about a world in which ICE doesn't exist. When it comes to the police, it is not crazy to think of having a police force that actually, quote, serves and protects, because the police today do not serve and protect. That is not what they were built for. The way that they are militarized, the weapons that they carry, that is not to serve and protect us, the people.
By the way,
it's not
yes.
crazy to imagine a world in which those institutions do not exist.
Can I just add a little data point there? So
Yes,
most
quickly.
things that people are concerned about when it comes to policing, when we say abolish the police, people go, well, there's going to be mayhem in the streets. It's going to be murder and rape and everything happening. On average, police departments spend 8% of their time addressing the issues that most people fear most significantly. So we could certainly shrink down policing up to 90% and not affect the things that people are most concerned about, and actually streamline and focus policing on those issues. I'm an abolitionist, but I'm speaking to the people who are saying, like, what about those concerns? Well, I can accommodate those concerns. Let's shrink down by 90%, get down and focus on homicide and rape and the things that people are most concerned about, and let go of the traffic policing, let go of the stop and frisk, let go of everything that you don't need an armed response for. We need, as the judge said, housing, we need jobs, we need education, and social services and social safety net. So that's just a little data point.
And we need them to stop looking like militaristic. I mean, even the park rangers in my park in Harlem look like they're militarized. I'm like, could you stop? All right, listen, here's a beautiful thing about 2021 is that we can have this conversation. The bad thing is it's only an hour, and we're all now y'all are getting revved up. Now everybody's like, no, I got, and now I have to send it back to Sonia from LPPI. I just want to say thank you to Julissa, to SUAVE, to the judge. I mean, I just want to say Natalia, actually, like where your familia would be, probably Nati or something. And to Kelly, thank you so much. This is a powerful conversation. It doesn't stop here. And we do it with love. And we do it because we understand that we are the future of this country and we decide what it looks like. Okay. Have a great rest of your conference. Mucho amor. Thank you so much, and stay involved.
Hey, everybody. That was just such a dynamic conversation. And part of the stuff that was already lifted up is the rampant police abuse against Black and brown bodies in this country at the hands of law enforcement. I know this personally. My cousin Paul Raya was killed by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department in June of 2019. And so to highlight the perspective of this, we are so pleased to share a video from Michelle and Ashley Monterosa, whose brother Sean was killed. Stay tuned.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for inviting us to Activating Justice Through a Latinx Lens. My name is Michelle Monterosa.
And I'm Ashley Monterosa, and we are the surviving sisters of our brother Sean Monterosa. And for those that don't know, on June 1st, 30 minutes before our brother was murdered, his last text message in a group chat to Michelle and I was the petition for George Floyd on change.org, and he asked us if we could sign this petition to get George Floyd justice. We didn't think much of it. Eventually, an hour later, we got a phone call getting notified that Sean had been murdered, and Sean was murdered by an unmarked pickup truck in Officer Jarrett Ton from the Vallejo Police Department. Sean was on his knees with his hands up when the unmarked pickup truck arrived to the Walgreens parking lot and shot through the windshield 5 times with an AR-15.
It only took one of those bullets to strike our brother in the neck, out the head. And it's one of these things after that phone call, we didn't think anything of it. We thought it was not true. but we shared locations with our brother, and this is when San Francisco was under curfew and shelter in place. No one could be out past the hours of 8 p.m. And then we looked at this location and it said the city of Vallejo. Vallejo, we're born and raised in San Francisco, so we had to drive at least 40 minutes to get to Vallejo. And it was from 2 a.m. up about 5:30 in the morning, trying to locate Sean, trying to get answers, and all we saw was yellow caution tape and the officers giving us a runaround. It wasn't until the next day that we couldn't find Sean at any of the local hospitals by calling, to where Ashley said, you know what, I'm gonna have to call the coroner's office. It was about 1 p.m. when Ashley gave him a call, gave him a description, and said Sean's birthday until the lady said Sean is here. We hadn't known that Sean was involved in an officer-involved shooting until our attorney, John Burris, gave us a call after going to
The June 3rd press conference.
The June 3rd press conference, and that's where Chief Shawnee Williams said that my brother was on his knees with his hands up surrendering when the officer murdered him the way he did. And it's one of these things that after June 2nd, we were told that we had to get on camera to demand justice for our brother. All we wanted was a week or two to grieve the loss of our only brother. And since then, it's been nonstop for our family. And my sister and I have been doing everything we can in our power to bring awareness to Sean's case. Right soon after the footage of my brother being murdered was released, the president of the Vallejo Police Union ordered the destruction of evidence in my brother's case. So that's already obstruction of justice. So the local DA has failed to prosecute these officers. She recused herself from the case and bounced the case to Attorney General at the time, Javier Becerra, which then he redacted what he said by saying he was going to take a full investigation and just said that he would do the destruction of evidence. Since then, it's been a long journey for justice, as going to elected officials, going on calls, demanding just accountability and transparency. Even on the 4-month anniversary, there wasn't any progress in our brother's case that we took ourselves and 15 other nonviolent protesters to Governor Gavin Newsom's house demanding justice or just a statement from him, which later we were met with 80 plus CHP officers who then arrested us and we spent 23 hours in county jail. I say this all to say because this is as far as that impacted families have to go to put their bodies on the line to demand justice for our loved one. And since then, we're doing everything we can to push for legislation and change, but our ultimate goal is to reach out to our Latino community and letting them know that police brutality is an issue that we face in our comunidades. Yes, immigration reform is important, but also police brutality is important because our hermanos, hermanas, fathers, mothers are all dying at the same rate as the police, as our Black community is. And I say this all again to say that we have a lot of Latinos who are in positions of power, which all we want is just help. We're asking for people to help us. A lot of us families can't do this alone, and I thank God every day for giving us, my sister and I and our family, the strength to do the advocating we do, but we recognize that within our communities, some familias can't, they don't have the capacity to do so. So when we say justice for Sean, we're saying justice for all our comunidades, all our hermanos y hermanas, and which ways you guys can support us is following the Justice for Sean on Instagram, signing our petitions, making calls, or just building a bridge between impacted families and elected officials. And I don't know what else you would like to say.
Honestly, I think us in our Latino community, we have to acknowledge that police brutality is indeed an issue in our community. A lot of people like to turn face and say, eso nunca va a pasar con mi hijo or anything, but this could happen to anyone, and I think it's time that we join our Black brothers and sisters in this fight against police brutality and work against police violence overall.
Thank you.
So we heard it from the Montarosa sisters that there are people in positions of power that need to carry this journey with families that are impacted by unjust systems. So we have a breakout room. You're going to go on the left-hand side, identify a session. There's 2 tracks. One if you identify as someone who is Latinx, and one if you don't. The Latinx breakout session will talk about issues that Maria Hinojosa brought up: anti-Blackness, discrimination, multiracial solidarity. For the Allies breakout, it's really thinking through what are the steps necessary to have a Latino lens in our carceral systems, and how can we lift up the nation's growing and youthful communities. Thank you so much, and can't wait to see you in the breakouts.